So the order that we're covering these classes of vertebrates is really an order of evolution. In that fish were the first vertebrates that evolved on the planet. Over time, a subgroup of fish sort of split off and started to adapt to being able to spend more time on land, and they were amphibians. A group of amphibians split off and eventually evolved into reptiles. So, if we think about amphibians and reptiles, what's a major difference in terms of where they can live? Joey?
Reptiles can live in colder places.
Not so much temperature. Dean?
Reptiles can live in drier places.
Yeah, reptiles are able to survive and live basically all of their lives and reproductive cycles on dry land. Amphibians were always linked back to the water because they relied on the water for what?
Lay their eggs.
For reproduction. Because they had external fertilization and external development, they had to return back to the water for that. And so reptiles, as a class, adapted several different traits which allowed them to be more successful on dry land permanently. Okay. So what are examples of reptiles? Give me one group of reptiles. Snakes. Okay? Lizards. Turtles, tortoises. Crocodiles, alligators. Yeah. Those are our major groups. What's going on here? All right. And so one of the characteristics, one of the adaptations that allows reptiles to be successful on dry land is their scales. So they have a body covering of scales, and you can see in this picture the individual scales. And those scales provide sort of a watertight barrier on the outside of the reptile. Therefore, they don't dry out very easily because water cannot escape through those scales. If you imagine, a frog, for example, with that very thin skin, under very dry conditions, it would dehydrate and dry out very easily. So reptiles develop this body covering of scales, which helps keep all that water in, allowing them to live in drier conditions. Some reptiles can change the color of those scales. Think of like chameleons and other types of reptiles. Pretty interesting. They're protective. Turtles, tortoises, their shell is a part of their body, so it's not something they could crawl in and out of. Right? It's part of their bones and their scales make up that shell. Reptiles are still cold-blooded, like fish and amphibians. So they don't regulate their body temperature internally. They rely on the outside environment. Their body temperature matches that of their surroundings. But they do have sometimes behavioral adaptations that allow them to change their body. For example, after a cold night, going into the sun on a rock in the morning to raise their body temperature. Or on a really hot day, moving into a cooler location to bring their body temperature down. Those are behavioral adaptations, but they're not regulating their body temperature internally. Again, the benefit is they don't require as much energy. So one of the factors that allowed reptiles to move permanently onto land was reproduction. So fish and amphibians relied on the water for reproduction. Okay? The sperm cells released into the water where they fertilized egg cells. The eggs stayed in the water so that they couldn't dry out where they developed into the young. Well, the adaptation reptiles have is a different form of fertilization. Reptiles have internal fertilization. And so in reptiles, the male deposits sperm inside of the female's reproductive tract. A moist environment inside of the female reptile, where those sperm cells can then swim to meet the individual egg cells and fertilize them. It also means they don't have to produce as many eggs. They don't have to produce thousands of eggs because it's much more likely for them to be fertilized and developed. And so the male deposits sperm into the female reproductive tract. If an egg cell gets fertilized by a sperm cell, then around it, the rest of what we would call the egg, so not the egg cell, but the egg, forms around that fertilized single cell and eventually embryo. Okay? And so then they lay the eggs afterwards. The eggs for reptiles have sort of a leathery, more flexible shell than what we think of as a bird egg. And inside of that egg is basically a nice little contained watery environment for the embryo to develop in. What else is in that egg? Nutrients that the embryo is going to use as it goes from a tiny little embryo into a fully formed organism. So that egg basically is taking that water where fish and amphibians need it to reproduce and putting it inside of a little container so that the embryo can develop inside of that. And they generally lay their eggs on land. They don't care for the eggs usually. They don't have to be incubated generally. Sometimes they're buried, sometimes they're not. And then when those eggs hatch, then the young are fully formed. So we say they have internal fertilization, but they still have external development. The embryos are growing in eggs outside of the body. In terms of circulation, so how many chambers were in a fish heart? Two simple. An atrium where blood comes in, a ventricle that pumps it out. How about amphibians? 3. 2 atrium where blood comes in, one from the lungs, one from the body, and then it mixes in the ventricle and then gets pumped out. Reptiles develop what we call a 3.5 chamber heart, which may sound a little strange at first, but if you look at it, it should make sense. So similar to the amphibian heart, there's 2 distinct chambers for each atrium. Then the ventricle is actually partially divided by a wall that splits it into, it's not quite, if it fully connected here, then these would be 2 separate chambers, but in reptiles they're not. It partially divides them. And what that means is the blood that comes in on this left side, on this right side, that's low in oxygen, can get pumped directly to the lungs. Now there is a little bit of mixing in this area, but much less so than if that wall wasn't there. So it's a little more efficient at getting oxygenated blood to the body cells. Okay, I'm going to show you a few different videos related to reptiles here. All right, so let's move on to birds now. So we've talked about fish, amphibians, reptiles. Now moving on to birds. And birds evolved from reptiles, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So birds have many adaptations, some for flight, although there are flightless birds which don't fly. So birds have a body covering of what? Feathers. And there's various types of feathers. So the kind you probably imagine if you're walking around and you see a feather, that's a flight feather. Okay, those long, sort of solid feathers, those are for flight. They come from the wings of the bird. But there are other types of feathers as well. Some of them you may have in your pillow at home, or blanket, or in a jacket you wear. What do we call it? Down. So you have a down jacket, a down comforter on your bed, a down pillow. Down is the name of a type of feather in a bird. Okay? And they're feathers that the bird uses for insulation. Okay? So the down in bedding and sleeping bags and jackets is generally from geese. And I don't know if you ever have one of those feathers come out of your pillow and poke you and you can pull it out. That's an actual feather from an actual bird, if it's natural down. And the sort of, you see the feathers all spread out, and that helps it to trap air, which traps heat. Also, some feathers are used for camouflage or for attracting mates, lots of different. What about the body temperature of birds? They are. They're warm-blooded. Okay. Birds are warm-blooded. Think of a penguin, for example, who live in extreme cold conditions and still survive because it maintains an elevated body temperature. How about fertilization? So, internal. They're just like reptiles. The male deposits sperm in the female reproductive system. It fertilizes an egg cell, and then the egg forms around it. So the thing we think of as an egg you buy in the grocery store, that doesn't form until after the egg cell has been released. Okay? And then the development of that embryo happens outside of the body, external, in the egg. Now, unlike reptile eggs, bird eggs often need to be incubated, which means kept at the proper temperature and moisture for them to grow and develop inside. So often the bird builds a nest, sits on the eggs, keeping them at the proper temperature. Birds were the first type of vertebrate to develop a full four-chambered heart. What's the benefit of a four-chambered heart? Emma? Yes. Oxygen-rich blood and oxygen-poor blood are kept completely separate without any mixing. And that allows for the most efficient delivery of oxygen to the cells. And this is important because birds use a lot of energy. Flight is very energy intensive. And so their muscles need an adequate supply of oxygen. And having a four-chambered heart is an adaptation that allows them to maintain that oxygen level. The right side of the heart receives blood from the body and sends it up to the lungs to be reoxygenated. That oxygenated blood comes back into the heart on the opposite side, and then just give me a minute, Joey. Okay, so the eggs of a bird are more brittle. They're not leathery and flexible. They are still waterproof, but they allow oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. Migration. Now we know many birds migrate or move to another area during certain times of the year. Do they migrate because they can't survive cold conditions? No, because they're warm-blooded. Why do they migrate? For food. Birds that eat insects, for example, are not going to have a great time in the winter in our area because there's not many insects around to eat. So many birds will migrate to another area where they can find more food. And I don't love how this is phrased because it's not necessarily flying south for the winter, it's just kind of what we say. But it's moving, flying to a new area with more abundance. Yes. So far as anyone know anything about the bones of birds? Aiden? Yeah, they're hollow inside and very lightweight. Now they do have some bone tissue inside, sort of to strengthen them, like these fibers of bone tissue. But they're much less dense than the bones of other animals. And again, this is an adaptation for flight, because the lower the weight, the easier, more energy efficient flight is. So like we said, birds evolved from reptiles. And one of the first fossils that really helped scientists understand this was a fossil called Archaeopteryx. Okay? This is what it looks like. The name means ancient bird, and Archaeopteryx sort of provided scientists with a fossil evidence of a definite link between ancient reptiles and birds. Archaeopteryx had some features that were bird-like and some that were reptile-like. This is the actual fossil. So it had wings, bird-like. However, it had claws at the end of its wings. That's more reptile-like. It had feathers covering its wings and tail. However, it had scales on its neck and its legs. Had feathers on the tail, but its tail had a bony base to it, which is more like a reptile. So it was an intermediate between reptiles and birds. That's sort of an artist's rendition of what Archaeopteryx may have looked like when it was alive. And here are some other sort of predecessors to birds, various types of reptile-like creatures with wings or certain characteristics of birds that have been proposed as related to birds.
Dabbing bird.
If birds are dabbing, it's officially over. All right.
It was so hurt and bad.
All right, so let's finish up with this slide. Just name the parts. We won't talk right now about what they all do. We'll get to that tomorrow. But this is an unfertilized bird egg. This is the egg you buy at the grocery store. This is what's inside of it. So obviously we have the shell around the outside. Below that, you have a very, very thin shell membrane. You know, that's what you peel off a hard-boiled egg when you're peeling it, that very thin membrane. You have the yolk, obviously, the yellow part in the middle of the egg. How many people like eggs sunny side up? Okay, so if you're making eggs sunny side up, you're trying not to rupture this yolk membrane that keeps the yolk together. When you poke it with your toast, you're rupturing that yolk membrane. The egg white that we call, that's technically called albumin. Then there's some parts you may not have really noticed. So if you crack an egg in a dish and look at it, attached to the yolk are a couple white sort of stringy things. They're called the chalazi. They're made of protein. When you crack an egg and you look at the wider end of the egg, you'll notice a little sort of bubble inside of the shell, between the shell membrane and the shell itself. That's called the air space. It's a little gap there. It's filled with air. And then finally, on the yolk of an egg, if you look very closely at a raw egg, you'll notice a little round patch of white on it. It's called the germinal disc. And in that disc is a tiny little cell that would have become the embryo if it were fertilized. It's called the blastoderm. Now the eggs we buy at the grocery store are unfertilized. That blastoderm was never fertilized by a sperm cell. How does a farmer make sure of this? Aiden? Yeah, they keep the males, the roosters, separate from the hens. Okay, or they don't have a rooster. If you're raising chickens for eggs alone, maybe you don't have a rooster at all, and therefore you know all those eggs will be unfertilized. The female, the hen, will continue to lay eggs even if there's no male around, even if they're not fertilized. And that's where we get the eggs we buy at the grocery store. Dean?
Did you also like wait?
That's just to tell if they are fertilized or not, but it's not to prevent them from being fertilized.